On the 28th of September 1978, John Paul I died after only 33 days as Pope. Conspiracy theorists believe he was murdered to prevent him carrying out an investigation into the Vatican's finances. Conspiracies on trial have examined the claim that the Vatican blocked investigation into the cause of the Pope's death. We found evidence to support the theory that there was at least an attempt at a cover-up. However, this is not proof of murder. We will now turn to the question of what took place in the Pope's last hours. The conspiracy theorist account is very different to the official one. In our third and final test, we will run through these accounts to see which is, scientifically, most plausible. There's no independent evidence, no photographs of the scene of death, and no police reports. All we have to go on is the evidence the Vatican has presented, but there are very different ways of interpreting that evidence. The official Vatican version of the Pope's last night is that he went to bed at 9:20 p.m. He died of a heart attack at 11 p.m. and was discovered in the morning by his secretary, Father McGee. He was sitting up in bed in the reading position, dead. Vatican sources say that he was holding a copy of the Imitation of Christ. He had a suitably saintly smile on his face, and his glasses were perched on the end of his nose. As the Vatican would have it, the Pope's death couldn't have been more peaceful. Life was snatched away in an instant, leaving him frozen in a sort of still life pose. The Pope met his maker with suitably edifying reading material in his hands and a smile on his lips. Many have said that the Vatican's account of how the Pope looked after what was effectively a massive heart attack is simply not believable. Dr. Carey is one of the UK's leading forensic pathologists. He's attended hundreds of crime scenes and sees the grim reality of death on a daily basis. Is the Pope's final position as the Vatican described it, in fact, possible?
I think there's some aspects of the position that are perfectly acceptable. For instance, him simply lying there peacefully with his glasses on his nose. I wouldn't have a problem with that at all as being a position that somebody who's had a very sudden death has ended up in. But the concept of a smile, I think, simply couldn't happen like that. Generally, your facial muscles go completely relaxed, and so the concept of whatever expression you had before death remaining would generally not apply. Generally, you wouldn't be able to go on gripping after death because your muscles of your forearms and hands would relax. In terms of what he died of, the cause of death given as myocardial infarction is at best an educated guess. The only way you could determine that would be through a post-mortem examination. And of course, there wasn't a post-mortem examination.
From our forensic pathologist's point of view, the Vatican's accounts of events has several holes. According to conspiracy theorists, there are even more holes to pick. The Vatican, they say, was inconsistent on the detail. At first it said the dead Pope was holding a copy of the Imitation of Christ. Then it said he was actually just holding a collection of sermons and meditations. Initially, it claimed the Pope's body had been found by his secretary, Father McGee. Then it emerged that the body was in fact found by the nun who brought the Pope his morning coffee. Was the nun written out of history because she knew too much? Conspiracy theorists think that the Vatican's version of events cannot be trusted. They've come up with an entirely different version, one they think is closer to the truth. During the 28th of September, the Pope's low blood pressure medicine was spiked with a fatal dose of the poison digitalis. At 9:20 p.m, the Pope went to bed and took his medicine. He died at about 4 a.m. He was discovered at 4:45 by the elderly nun, Sister Vincenza. She found the dead Pope sitting up in bed in the reading position. The papers he was clutching were not sermons or meditations. They were in fact documents outlining the controversial changes he intended to make, legitimizing the birth control pill and ordering an investigation into the Vatican Bank. The expression on his face was one of agony.
His lips were drawn back into a macabre grimace. His gums were exposed. His eyeballs were almost popping out of the sockets. There was a look of horror on his face.
We have furnished forensic pathologist Dr. Carey with the facts as they are presented in the conspiracy theory. Does he think this is a more believable version of events?
It all sounds a bit theatrical, really, this grimacing expression. There's no particular reason why someone should adopt the sort of grimace once they've died, because again, the facial muscles will be relaxed. The only time where you may get peculiar facial expressions is strangulation, really, and ligature strangulation, where the tongue may protrude somewhat and the eyes bulge.
Dr. Carey sees another problem with the conspiracy theory. Digitalis poisoning would result in a gradual, unpleasant death, not a sudden one. Crucially, John Paul I would have had plenty of warning that there was something wrong.
In general, the poisoning would sort of catch up with someone progressively, so there would be this period of being acutely unwell in the preceding hours, perhaps. One might anticipate that he would seek help.
There was no distress signal from the Pope that night. He didn't even press the panic button next to his bed. The evidence points to a sudden death, not one by digitalis poisoning. Our expert toxicologist sees one more important difficulty with the conspiracy theory.
Well, I think it would be quite difficult to get the dose of digoxin into the person. One possible route that's suggested is that it's in a liquid medicine that he had access to. But as I've shown you, you've got to get around about 5 to 10 milligrams of digoxin into that medicine. It would also depend on him only having a very small amount of that medicine left so that he drank all of it in one go. So that, I think, is the major problem here.
According to the experts, the two interpretations of the Pope's last night are both flawed. The Vatican's version is undermined by their insistence that the Pope was discovered in a state of bliss. The conspirators' version is belied by the toxicological evidence. The poison digitalis doesn't work in the way the conspirators claim. There is a third account of what happened the night the Pope died, put forward by journalist John Cornwell. In this version, we end with the same scene, the dead Pope propped up in bed. We'll now turn back the clock and examine a final version of what might have taken place beforehand. At an unspecified time during the night, the Pope was struck down by a fatal pulmonary embolism. This diagnosis, it's claimed, fits new evidence that the Pope had chest pains the day before he died. At 10:55 p.m, Father McGee looked into the Pope's bedroom and found him dead in a crumpled heap on the floor. McGee called the other secretary, Lorenzi. They picked the Pope up and placed him in bed. They were motivated by two things: the desire to preserve the Pope's dignity in death and the fear that they would be criticized for failing to call a doctor when the Pope was having chest pains earlier. They decided to create the impression that the Pope died peacefully and without warning. They placed sheets of paper in the Pope's hands to make it look as though he'd been reading, and they put his glasses on the end of his nose. This secretly staged scene was what Sister Vincenza walked in on the following morning. What does Dr. Carey think of the idea that the Pope's body was moved and then manipulated into its final pose?
I see no reason against any of that being possible. I think if they positioned his body soon after death, he would be floppy and relaxed, and so you could easily move him into whatever position you liked.
In this account, the secretaries weren't covering up a murder, they were covering up the grim reality of a painful death. It has to be said, this is an extremely difficult theory to prove.
The problem is it's both possible and plausible, but there isn't any positive evidence for it. So we're into the realms of speculation, really.
Our test has explored three different versions of what might have happened on the night of the 28th of September, 1978. Our third scenario stands up to a forensic pathologist's analysis best. There are no glaring holes, and the Pope's slightly unnatural pose is explained. But as has been pointed out, this version is purely speculative. So where does all this leave our conspiracy theory that John Paul I was murdered?
Well, I think it's a bit unfair to advance a theory that someone's been poisoned if you don't have any evidence for it. I think it defies logic, really.
But the conspiracy theorists remain undeterred by the lack of concrete evidence in this case.
Looking at the Pope's death, right now, you would not find somebody just holding a smoking gun. The conditions, the evidence, as in most murder cases, remains circumstantial. But the evidence is certainly very, very substantial. Almost everything that the Vatican said has been proven to be a lie. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. Why insist on this immediate embalming? And why insist that not one drop of his blood be removed? None of these things can be explained. And they all point to, I think, the fact that he was murdered.
Employing toxicology, pathology, and reconstruction, conspiracies on trial have subjected the conspiracy theory that states that Pope John Paul I was murdered to rigorous scientific analysis. We have shown that the Pope was embalmed with undue haste and that Vatican officials have serious questions to answer about their actions in the immediate aftermath of the Pope's death. However, there is no evidence to support the claim that the embalming was done to cover up the presence of a deadly poison in the Pope's blood. The evidence put forward by the conspirators crumbles in the face of scientific testing. Conspiracies on Trial find this conspiracy theory unproven.